What's up, y'all? I hope y'all enjoyed dinner. So I have a bit of a question to start out with. How many of y'all have taken an economics class before? Yeah. A few of y'all. I'm sure it was probably the most exciting class y'all have ever taken. But just to reiterate, economics is the study of the distribution of resources. However, it is oftentimes overlooked in many scenarios. And it can be used in many different ways, shapes, and forms. As a 2023 study showed, mice based in a certain scenario use two vital parts of their brain. These two parts of their brain are deeply involved in economic decision making. And this presents somewhat of an interesting theory where economics is deeply ingrained in our decision making processes innately. So today I'll be discussing three economic principles that can be used to contextualize the issue of decision making and an easy vetting process anyone can use to help them make decisions. So these three principles are the cost benefit, what is a decision worth, second is the long-term versus the short-term projections, what are the implications of a decision I make, and third is Say's law, supply creates its own demand. First and foremost, what is a cost-benefit analysis? A cost-benefit analysis is an analysis used by economists to evaluate the pros and cons of a decision. These decisions can vary in nature, and they oftentimes use a ratio of these pros and cons to help evaluate whether a situation is viable. However, as the Harvard Business Review puts it, 35,000 decisions are made each day, many of which are binary in nature, but there are oftentimes several that are not, given infinite possibilities. And as Kellogg School of Management from Northwestern puts it, we are only programmed to function within 8 to 15 options. So given infinite solutions, that's a lot. The second key point is the short term versus the long term. The short term is oftentimes the primary focus of any decision we make. We oftentimes only think about the short term implications of a decision we make. However, in classical economics, it is presented that the short term is what heavily influences the long term. And as shown, through the rise of social media, we oftentimes get caught up in this cyclical gratification of any apps or any websites that we use. However, it's important to also think about the projections, about where our future is going and how we can help to create the future we desire. And finally, but just hold on to that thought. Through these first two, we've seen two important things emerge. First and foremost, that the resources that we have are our supply, and any decisions we make are our demand. And you see that point right there in the middle? That's our equilibrium point. That is the point where the optimal decision is made. But how do we find this point? And additionally, it's presented that supply creates its own demand in a cyclical nature, which is Say's law. As presented here, it's shown that any decision we make and any resources that we have happen in somewhat of a cyclic nature. Any resources we have are passed over to any opportunities created in the demand, and then furthermore, those reiterate and require more supply from our end. So, as we see here, we've talked about the cost benefit, the long-term and short-term, and Say's law. But what are we supposed to do about this? Well, this is where the SWOT analysis comes into play. The first 2 points of the SWOT analysis are first and foremost the strengths. What are the pros of a situation? And what do I seek to gain from this situation? The second are the weaknesses. What am I losing from this situation and what drawbacks does it have? These first two are very important in contextualizing the fundamental pros and cons, addressing our cost-benefit analysis. However, these next two help with the long-term and short-term, as well as Say's law. The opportunities and the threats. The opportunities are what does this decision do in my favor, and the threats are how am I vulnerable if I make this decision. These help to accurately create a projection of where we're going in the future, and how to properly allocate time and resources to achieving that future. But you may be wondering, why should I use this strategy at all? This seems like a lot of extra effort for not as much payoff as I think it will. Well, economics always seems to have some sort of answer for everything, and that's where the Pareto principle comes into play. The Pareto principle is a fundamental theorem in economics which discusses how 20% of the work can lead to 80% of the outcome. So by employing just 20% of the effort that you take to make a decision, you can help extend the viability of your decision by 80%. And as Robert Shiller says, some of the best theorizing comes after collecting data because you become aware of another reality. By accurately vetting and researching everything that you're doing, and by applying just 20% of the SWOT analysis method, we are able to better create a future and a solution that we aspire for. So just to recap, we've talked about the cost-benefit analysis, the short-term and long-term projections, which discuss the future of what we're trying to achieve. And finally, Say's law, the fact that supply, any resources at any time, and any possibilities we have, is a recurring cycle. So just use SWOT to build the future you desire.